April 23, 1945, 1,342 hours, outside Wesel, Germany. Sergeant Thomas McKenna was 3 steps into the field when he realized his mistake. The broken fence post, the weathered warning sign half buried in mud, its German text still legible, Achtung Minen, the disturbed earth in unnaturally regular intervals. All the signs he'd been trained to recognize, all the warnings that should have stopped him before his boot touched ground beyond the road. But he'd been chasing the German, a lone Wehrmacht soldier, no more than 19, fleeing east through the ruins of what had once been farmland. McKenna had seen him disappear around the abandoned barn and followed without thinking, rifle raised, jaw clenched with the familiar rage that had carried him through France, through Belgium, through the Rhineland. Another grey uniform to eliminate, another enemy to erase from the landscape. Now he stood, frozen, right foot planted on soil that might be his grave, left foot still on the gravel road behind him, his body suspended between safety and oblivion. The wind carried the smell of cordite and wet earth. Somewhere to the north, artillery rumbled, the war grinding forward, while Thomas McKenna balanced motionless in a moment that had become infinite. His breathing had gone shallow. Sweat formed despite the April cold. He'd hated them for 22 months, every single one. The education. Thomas McKenna learned to hate Germans on June 7, 1944, on Omaha Beach. Not during the landing. The chaos of that morning left no room for emotion beyond animal terror. But the day after, walking the tide line with the other survivors of his unit, counting. 63 men had loaded onto the Higgins boat at 06:30 the previous morning. 19 had made it past the seawall. The rest lay scattered across the beach or had simply disappeared into the surf, pulled under by the weight of their equipment, drowned in 6 feet of water, while machine gun fire churned the surface above them. Private Danny Kowalski, who'd taught McKenna to play poker during the crossing. Corporal James Hensley, who'd showed him pictures of his daughter every evening for 3 months. Lieutenant Robert Hammond, 26 years old, dead before his boots touched French sand. All of them killed by Germans. McKenna had been a machinist in Pittsburgh before the war. He'd fixed lathes and milling machines, married his high school sweetheart, planned to open his own shop after saving enough money. He had no particular feelings about Germans. They were just people on the other side of an ocean, caught up in politics he didn't fully understand. Then he'd waded through water stained red with American blood. His hatred grew methodical after that, clinical. He learned the German rank insignia so he could identify officers at a distance. He memorized Wehrmacht tactics so he could anticipate their movements. He studied their language, not to communicate, but to understand the orders being shouted before German soldiers executed them. Every piece of knowledge was ammunition. Every fact about the enemy was a tool for their destruction. He became very good at killing Germans. By August, his unit had pushed inland. By September, they'd crossed into Belgium. By December, they'd reached the German border itself, and with every mile, every village, every foxhole and roadblock and desperate last stand, McKenna's hatred calcified into something permanent and unshakable. The Ardennes offensive in December 1944 confirmed what he already knew. The massacre at Malmedy, 84 American prisoners gunned down in a snowy field, eliminated any remaining doubt. These weren't soldiers, they were murderers in uniform. His fellow soldiers noticed. Some shared his intensity, most didn't. War was duty for them, a job to finish so they could go home. But for McKenna, it had become personal. Lieutenant Morrison pulled him aside after McKenna had refused to accept the surrender of 3 German soldiers, forcing them to run across open ground where a distant machine gun nest cut them down. "We take prisoners, Sergeant." "They can surrender to someone else, sir." Morrison hadn't pressed the issue. The truth was, the army needed men like McKenna in April 1945. Men who wouldn't hesitate. Men who wouldn't question. Men who hated enough to do what was necessary as the Reich collapsed into rubble and fanatic resistance. So when McKenna saw the lone German soldier slipping through the ruins near Wesel, he didn't call out for surrender. He didn't fire a warning shot. He simply pursued, weapon ready, intent absolute, and walked directly into a minefield. The mathematics of death. The German military had planted approximately 1.5 million mines across Western Europe by 1945. Anti-personnel mines like the Shoe Mine 42, wooden boxes packed with TNT, undetectable by metal detectors. Anti-tank mines like the Teller 35, capable of destroying a Sherman tank. And improvised devices, hastily buried during retreat, mapped only in the minds of men who were likely dead or captured by the time Allied forces arrived. McKenna knew the statistics. He'd sat through the briefings. One wrong step meant death or, worse, survival with catastrophic injuries. The medics had a grim joke, better dead than LOBG, legs blown off, guts hanging out. He'd seen mine casualties. Private Carson, screaming for his mother as blood poured from where his legs had been. Corporal D'Angelo, conscious while the medics tried to keep his intestines inside his body cavity. The images stayed with him, filed away in the catalogue of German atrocities. Now it was his turn to join that catalogue. He tried to calculate odds. His right foot was planted firmly. No explosion. That meant either no mine directly beneath him or a pressure release mine that would detonate when he lifted his foot. The latter was less common, mostly used in defensive installations, not improvised minefields. But not impossible. 3 steps ahead, the disturbed soil pattern suggested a deliberate grid. Someone had planted these methodically, which meant a professional Wehrmacht engineer unit, not desperate Volkssturm militia. Professional meant consistent spacing. Consistent spacing meant, if he'd already survived one step, the next mine was probably 60 to 90 centimeters ahead. Probably. He couldn't move forward. Couldn't turn around without shifting his weight. Couldn't call for help. The rest of his squad was 200 meters north, clearing a farmhouse. They wouldn't hear him over the distant artillery. His rifle had become impossibly heavy. The strap cut into his shoulder. Sweat ran into his eyes. 18 minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Then he heard footsteps on the gravel road behind him. The enemy. The German soldier emerged from behind the barn, hands raised, palms open. The same soldier McKenna had been chasing, young face under the Wehrmacht helmet, brown eyes wide, uniform caked with mud and road dust. No visible weapons. An equipment belt, but no ammunition pouches. He was speaking German, rapid fire, urgent. McKenna's hand moved to his holstered pistol, but he couldn't draw without shifting his weight. The German saw the motion, shook his head violently, still talking. He gestured at the ground around McKenna, at the field, at the disturbed earth. Minen! Bewegung nicht! McKenna had learned enough German to understand. Mines. Don't move. The soldier's accent was northern. Hamburg, maybe. Definitely not Bavarian or Austrian. His uniform bore the insignia of the 116th Panzer Division, though the unit had been shattered weeks ago during the Rhine crossing. A survivor. A straggler. Probably trying to make it home, or at least away from the collapsing front. And now he was walking toward McKenna, with slow, deliberate steps. Stop, McKenna managed. Halt! The German didn't halt. He'd gone quiet, his eyes locked on the ground, reading the subtle patterns McKenna couldn't see from his frozen position. Each footfall was calculated, tested first with a gentle touch before committing weight. Professional movement. Engineer training. He stopped 2 meters away. Langsam, he said quietly, slowly. Then, in heavily accented English, You move, I say how. Why? The word came out harsh. The German looked at him directly for the first time. Something passed across his face. Exhaustion, perhaps, or resignation. He answered in German, slowly enough that McKenna could pass it. Weil ich es kann, because I can. Then added, und weil der Krieg vorbei ist, and because the war is over. It wasn't over, not officially. But, standing in that field, American and German, suspended in mutual recognition of the absurdity of their situation, it felt true enough. Your left foot, the German said in English. Forward, 10 centimeter. There is clean earth. McKenna didn't move. Every instinct screamed trap, deception, a final act of vengeance from a cornered enemy. I was pioneer, the German said. Engineer. I plant these. He gestured at the field. Not these exact, but same. Shoe mine, teller mine. I know pattern. You could be lying. Ja, could be. The German tilted his head slightly. But I am not. Left foot, 10 centimeter forward, then right foot beside, then 3-step. Right, diagonal. Then you are on road. McKenna's leg had started to cramp from the unnatural position. Muscle tremors ran through his calf. Much longer, and he'd collapse regardless of mines. The German saw it. Soon you fall. Then, he made a flat gesture with his hand. Boom. The choice. Later, McKenna would try to explain the decision to other soldiers. He never found adequate words. It wasn't trust. He didn't trust the German. It wasn't mercy or recognition of shared humanity. Those concepts felt too abstract, too philosophical for the moment. It was simpler and more complicated than that. It was calculation without certainty, data without sufficient evidence. A choice made not because it was good, but because every alternative was worse. He moved his left foot forward 10 centimeters. No explosion. Clean earth, just as the German had said. McKenna transferred weight slowly, muscle by muscle, waiting for the pressure plate click that would be the last sound he'd hear. Nothing. Right foot, the German said, beside left, same level. McKenna obeyed. Standing straight now, both feet planted, still in the field, but no longer in the impossible frozen position. Blood flow returning to his leg brought needle-sharp pain. Now 3-step, right diagonal, I show. The German pointed to spots on the ground. Here, 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 you understand? Yeah. Go slow, feel ground before weight. McKenna took the first step. His boot touched earth that felt the same as all the other earth, soft, yielding, ordinary. He pressed down gradually. Nothing. Second step. Third step. And then he was on the gravel road, legs shaking, hands trembling with released adrenaline. He turned to face the German, who remained in the field, between the mines he'd identified through knowledge and memory. McKenna's pistol was drawn before conscious thought. The German watched the movement, but didn't raise his hands again. He looked tired. Very tired. You walk out the same way, McKenna heard himself say. Backward. Retrace. The German nodded, took the 3 steps in reverse, carefully shifted his feet, moved backward with the same deliberate precision he'd shown approaching. 20 seconds later, he stood on the road 10 meters from McKenna. They regarded each other. The German was perhaps 19, hollow cheeks, shadows under his eyes, a boy who'd learned to kill efficiently, to plant devices that would tear strangers apart, to fight in a war he'd likely been conscripted into before he'd finished growing. McKenna was 26. He'd spent nearly 2 years learning to hate this boy, and everyone who looked like him. Go, McKenna said, lowering the pistol. East. Don't let me see you again. The German stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached up and removed his helmet. Dark hair plastered to his skull with sweat. He held McKenna's gaze, nodded once. A gesture of what? acknowledgement, respect, understanding, and turned east. McKenna watched him walk away until he disappeared into the ruins. Then he holstered his pistol, picked up his rifle, and headed north to rejoin his squad. He told no one what had happened. The after. The war in Europe ended 16 days later. McKenna returned to Pittsburgh in November 1945. He married his sweetheart as planned, opened his machine shop in 1947, had 3 children, lived what appeared to be a normal, successful American life. But he never spoke about the minefield. His son found the story in a letter McKenna had written in 1993, discovered after his father's death in 1995. It was addressed to no one, or perhaps to everyone, an accounting of a debt that could never be repaid. "I don't know his name," McKenna had written. "I don't know if he survived the war. I don't know if he made it home to Hamburg or wherever he was from. I spent 22 months learning to hate Germans, and it took 22 minutes in a minefield to realize that hate made me blind. Not blind to what they'd done, I saw that clearly enough. Blind to what we all were, soldiers in a machine, trying to survive. Some fighting for evil, some fighting to stop it, all of us caught in the gears. He could have walked away. I would have died in that field and no one would have known. One more casualty among millions. He gained nothing by helping me, risked nothing except wasting his own time when he should have been escaping. But he stopped anyway. Because he could. Because the war was over even if the shooting hadn't stopped. I think about that German soldier every day. I hope he made it home. I hope he lived a long life. I hope someone showed him the same mercy he showed me, there on a road outside Wesel, when he had every reason to let me die, and no reason at all to save me, except that it was the right thing to do. I learned to hate in this war. It was easy. What that German engineer taught me was harder, that even justified hatred can blind you to grace when it appears in the most unlikely forms. The letter was found among McKenna's effects, with his discharge papers, his Silver Star citation, and the photograph of Omaha Beach, taken in 1994 during the 50th anniversary commemoration. On the back of the photograph, in McKenna's handwriting, "I remember the hate. I choose to remember the minefield." The pattern. Historians estimate that between 100,000 and 200,000 individual acts of mercy occurred between Allied and Axis soldiers during World War II. Informal truces, battlefield aid to wounded enemies, prisoners escorted to safety rather than shot, small mercies in an ocean of industrial killing. These stories rarely appear in official histories. They don't fit the necessary narrative of good versus evil, though that narrative is fundamentally true. The Reich was evil. The war was necessary. Liberation was righteous. But wars are fought by human beings, and human beings are complex, even when the causes they serve are not. What makes McKenna's story remarkable isn't that a German soldier showed mercy, it's that McKenna recognized it, accepted it, allowed it to change him, however slightly, however privately. He didn't stop believing the war was necessary, didn't excuse German atrocities, didn't regret the Germans he'd killed in service of victory, but he also didn't forget that one nameless German who, in April 1945, chose decency when cruelty would have been easier and more explicable. The minefield became metaphor, the careful steps between explosions, the necessity of guidance from someone who knew the hidden patterns, the choice to trust when trust defied reason, the recognition that survival sometimes requires accepting help from unlikely sources. McKenna kept his hatred after April 23, 1945, but he learned to see past it when necessary, to recognize that the categories we construct, enemy and ally, good and evil, us and them, are essential for war, but insufficient for understanding human experience. April 23rd, 1,342 hours, outside. Wesel. The sergeant learned to hate every German he saw, until one saved his life. Not because they were friends, not because they shared ideals, but because, for 22 minutes, they shared ground between the mines, and one man knew the way through while the other needed guidance. Sometimes that's enough.